Hello, and welcome back to our variety show, Azimuth Podcast. Today marks the second anniversary of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and will be the focus of our first segment. My name is Kimberly McNabb, and as always, next to me is my husband, Barrett McNabb.
Thanks, Kimberly. Yes, unfortunately today marks the complete incompetence of the Biden administration surrounding the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'd like to give our viewers some background. Operation Enduring Freedom, also known as OEF, was the official name given to the U.S. and coalition-led military operation initiated after September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Its primary objective was to dismantle al-Qaeda and deny it a safe haven in Afghanistan by removing the Taliban from power. Here's a brief overview.
The beginning was a post-9/11 response. September 11, 2001. Terrorists hijacked 4 planes, crashing 2 into New York City's World Trade Center towers, 1 into the Pentagon, and the last, United Flight 93, into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers bravely intervened. September 20th, 2001, President George W. Bush addressed Congress, stating that if the Taliban did not hand over Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders responsible for the 9/11 attacks, the United States would initiate military action.
So with those initial strikes and ground operations, on October 7, 2001, the U.S. and U.K. launched aerial bombing campaigns against the Taliban and al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan. In tandem with the bombing campaign, the CIA and Special Forces collaborated with the Northern Alliance, an Afghan opposition group, to combat the Taliban on the ground. By December 2001, the Taliban had lost control of Kabul, and their rule was effectively over in most parts of Afghanistan. Over the prolonged conflict and search for bin Laden, U.S. coalition forces also continued to escalate in fight. While the Taliban regime had been quickly toppled, both Taliban and al-Qaeda elements transformed into an insurgent group and led a prolonged conflict. There are 2 types of battlefields, linear and nonlinear. The linear battlefield is typically used in a high-intensity conflict. The nonlinear battlefield is used in a low-intensity conflict, and they both have support zones, battle zones, and disruption zones. If you can imagine a village in the mountains or a airfield or a camp in Pakistan as their support zone, and as the fighters move out to engage coalition forces, that's the battle zone. The disruption zone is areas where they do reconnaissance and plant IEDs in order to disrupt the movements and actions of coalition forces. The U.S. and coalition forces focused on stabilizing the nation, fighting against insurgent activities, and attempting to establish a functioning Afghan democracy. It was at this time that I deployed to combat as an embedded military advisor to 3rd Kandak 2nd Brigade Afghan National Army. I was a battalion operations, intelligence, and executive advisor. So I was on a 7-person team that was embedded with the Afghan Army in a infantry battalion, or as the Afghan National Army calls it, a Kandak. And there was 16 Americans and 650 Afghan soldiers. And we ate, slept, fought, trained, laughed, cried together. And, really what was supposed to happen is we were going to pull this infantry Kandak or battalion offline and train. And there was nothing happening with that. We had to train on the go. We were engaged in full combat from the moment that we got to the forward operating base in Kalat, Zabul province. And so it was, warfare. I mean, it was guerrilla tactics, insurgent warfare called COIN, counterinsurgency warfare, and it was, very intense. The Afghan troops, the soldiers, were amazing warriors, absolutely amazing warriors, but they were terrible soldiers. And what I mean by that is they had no qualms about running up a hill and bravely assaulting a position by themselves. But usually you're not successful when you do that. You need fire and maneuver. You need a base squad to be laying
plan.
down. Yep, laying down suppressive fire, and then a maneuver element to maneuver. And so it was really difficult to get this type of concept down, that it's not the individual. It's the team that's going to get it done. And part of the thing that I did with planning operations alongside the operations officer, who's a Afghani major, we would teach them the MDMP, military decision making process, and some of that was very difficult because to the letter of the law of MDMP, as you're developing your courses of action, you do 3 courses of action that you present to the commander. So you plan how to do the operation 3 different ways, and I got pushback, and he said, "Well, why? Why are you doing 3 plans? We're only going to do one of them." And I said, "Well, that's true, but we want to be able to give the commander options." And so it was that kind of resistance to learning doctrine. It is an example. Another example is there was just a lack of predictive analysis for the troops. They would be given a uniform for the winter, a uniform for the summer, so winter boots, gloves, hats. But the thing is it was in the summertime. So they went down to the bazaar and they sold all their winter gear, and they had flip-flops. And then all of a sudden, winter came, and they didn't have their winter gear. And so they're running around in flip-flops with snow on the ground. And they just didn't foresee a lot of what was about to happen. And some of it comes down to a lot of people in the news, and a lot of people and military pundits and things like that said that the Afghanistan is corrupt. Everybody's just absolutely corrupt there. And I would push back a little bit and say it's not necessarily a atmosphere of corruption as it is an atmosphere of survival. And it's very tough there. The terrain is not forgiving. There's really only 2 types of terrain in Afghanistan. In the U.S. Army, when you're doing land navigation, you learn about major terrain and minor terrain. And there's hills, valleys, ridges, depressions, cut, fill, cliff, and those are all terrain features. Afghanistan only has 2. It has uphill or about to go uphill. If you find yourself going downhill, that's only because you're about to go uphill, and that's all I ever experienced as a light infantryman fighting in Afghanistan. But the survival of people taken a little bit off the top, and this really becomes a problem when young soldiers can't trust their officers and their leaders. Sadly, we would be present for pay, and the soldiers would get pay, but the battalion would take a cut of the soldiers' pay, and then the company commander would take a cut of the soldiers' pay, and then the platoon leader would take a cut of the soldiers' pay, and then the soldier would finally get paid. And to see that in action is just horrible. And in talking to them and advising them, look, that's not the way you want to build trust and morale and things. That's just the way it was. It was just the way it was. Again, it wasn't corruption. It was this is the way it is. This is the culture. And so you have to be careful when you're trying to impress Western values on another culture, especially when you're trying to transform their military. A lot of militaries in the world do not have a robust non-commissioned officer corps, such as what we have in the United States Army and a lot of European armies. But definitely the Russians don't have an established non-commissioned officer corps. They have privates that have been in the Army for so long that they now are a sergeant, but they're not empowered to do anything. And the same thing is true in Afghanistan. So, similarly, as we were teaching, the U.S. Army doctrine, the same thing was happening in Iraq a number of years later when ISIS or ISIL, depending upon who you talk to, was marching towards Baghdad, getting an immediate call for military trainers to come out and teach MDMP, military decision-making process. And I was part of that decision, and as I was talking to the U.S. Army Central Command commanding general, I said, it's too late. It's too late to teach them. And we can go teach them MDMP, but if we've been teaching them for 20 years and they haven't gotten it yet, jumping in at the last second just as they're about to fall and teaching them MDMP is not going to work. I mean, it's too late. And so I think that is kind of what happened, is that we left them too late, and we'll get into that a little bit further. But this is just my experience in Afghanistan when I was there from 2007 to 2008. Again, as an embedded military advisor in RC South. But to continue on with the history lesson, the hunt for Osama bin Laden continued for years, and he was eventually located and killed by U.S. Navy SEALs in Abbottabad, Pakistan on May 2nd, 2011.
Drawdown and transition to Afghan control. Over the years, the United States began a gradual drawdown of its forces in Afghanistan, transferring security responsibilities to the Afghan National Security Forces. In 2014, the combat role of the United States and coalition forces officially ended, shifting to a train, advise, and assist role. This was marked by the end of OEF and the initiation of Operation Freedom's Citadel. Taliban resurgence and United States agreement. Despite efforts to stabilize the country, the Taliban continued to reign territory and power throughout the late 2010s. On February 29, 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed an agreement in Doha, Qatar, setting the stage for a full U.S. withdrawal. The pact included stipulations about the intra-Afghan negotiations and assurances from the Taliban not to harbor terrorist groups threatening the United States or its allies.
Well, this brings us to the end of U.S. presence. Despite the Doha Agreement, violence continued, and U.S. troops started their final withdrawal in 2021. The Taliban rapidly captured territory. By August 15, 2021, the Taliban had taken control of Kabul, making a definitive end to the U.S.-backed government's rule. On August 26, 2021, during the massive evacuation efforts from Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul, a suicide bombing occurred on the Abbey Gate at the airport. This attack was one of the deadliest incidences in U.S. forces in the entirety of the Afghanistan conflict. 13 U.S. service members were killed. This included 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 Army soldier. These service members were actively assisting the evacuation of American citizens, Afghan allies, and others seeking to leave Afghanistan after the rapid takeover of the country by the Taliban. Over 150 Afghan civilians were also killed in this blast, and many more were wounded. On August 30th, 2021, 2 years ago today, the last U.S. military flight left Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport, officially ending America's longest war. While Operation Enduring Freedom formally ended in 2014 and transitioned to Operation Freedom Sentinel, the broader conflict in Afghanistan and the U.S. involvement spanned 2 decades. The consequences and ramifications of this conflict are complex and have impacted Afghan society, geopolitics, and foreign policy in many profound ways.
So, Barrett, what do you see as the main strategic, operational, and tactical problems with the withdrawal?
Well, first of all, we should not have pulled out like we did. And any of the military advisors that the Biden administration had from the Department of Defense that were ignored, and or if they brought up the correct information and the Biden administration overrode that information, that was just the absolute failure right there. I'm currently bringing up a map here that has the 5 regional commands that were in Afghanistan. And you can see by the color codes, the Regional Command North is in the blue, Regional Command West is in the pink or fuchsia, Regional Command South is yellow, and Regional Command East is a little bit orange, and then center mass of Regional Command East is the lime green, and that's Regional Command Kabul. And so each of these 5 regions had countries that were responsible for them. So, for instance, the United States was responsible for RC East, and the British, the Canadians, and the Netherlands Norwegians were responsible for RC South, the Italians responsible for RC West, the Germans responsible for RC North, and the French were responsible for RC Kabul. To pull out of all of the regional commands at the same time was a huge strategic mistake. What should have happened is it should have been a phased withdrawal. And I know there's going to be somebody that was on the planning and saying, well, this was a phased withdrawal, but no, it wasn't. What should have happened is a regional command should have been evacuated, or half of a regional command should have been evacuated, or performed retrograde operations, and then seen what happened. If the Taliban were easily able to overrun the Afghan National Army forces, then we would be postured to be able to move in and retake that terrain and realize that they're not quite ready yet. They had the men, the weapons and equipment, but they didn't have the intestinal fortitude to stand up to the Taliban. And that was really unfortunate. But I think by collapsing early and having only one extraction route, one APOD, or aerial port of debarkation, which was the airport in Kabul, just created an effect that just killed the morale of the forces, and it just beyond sad to be able to see this not be a phased withdrawal, and to know all the villages that I went into and all the little girls that 2 years ago I had a conversation with somebody and I said, the worst thing is I know what's going to happen to them. I know what's going to happen. The Taliban gave assurances 2 years ago, and surprise, they lied. And they've rolled back education. They've rolled back, working opportunities, NGO, non-governmental organizations that are providing aid. Those have gone away as well. And, it's sad. It's absolutely sad. And, the biggest problem that Afghanistan has was its obviously the conflict between the Taliban and the democratic elected government is all the resources that Afghanistan has. I'd be on patrol and go by a mountain that was literally bleeding rust. I mean, the mountain was rusting because of all of the iron ore that was in the mountain. And as far as opium production goes, I would have to say that the one thing that the Taliban has done is it has virtually eradicated all of the poppy fields in Afghanistan. So that's about the only. So it's made heroin worldwide harder to get. The prices are going up because obviously there's not any more being produced. But that's the only positive. The negative is truly the impact of all of the men, women, and children that don't want to be under Taliban rule. And it's really hard to defeat an enemy. You can destroy them. These are all military tactical tasks. You can contain them. You can interdict. You can attack. You can destroy. But it's almost impossible to defeat an enemy, because not only does that mean that you are eliminating all of the combat power, but you're eliminating the will to fight, right? So even if there's just one person that still wants to fight and is just quiet, then it's just going to start breeding, the levels of warfare, starting out with latent and incipient insurgencies, moving on to guerrilla warfare, and then moving on to a war of movement. And when the Afghan army started collapsing and the Taliban started securing Afghan equipment that was donated by coalition forces, they were just able to continue to multiply their combat power and really turn that into a war of movement to finally collapse the government. However, it didn't have to be that way. And, the fact that we are now in the second anniversary of that botched withdrawal, it's just absolutely sad. But that concludes our segment covering the anniversary of this tragic day. Please stay tuned for our second segment after these messages.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy our show with all the stories we share, we would love your support.
And it's as easy as clicking that subscribe or follow button. This will ensure you never miss an episode and keeps us bringing you these important stories. Your support makes a huge difference. Thank you so much for being part of our podcast family.
Thanks, and keep tuning in.